A young entrepreneur fresh from delivering a groundbreaking presentation at the Global Innovation Summit was prepared to board her private jet and return home. But when she arrived at the exclusive terminal, everything took a shocking turn. A member of the flight crew denied her entry, openly questioning her identity and status in front of staff and other travelers. Just moments later, her response would set off a chain of events so dramatic that it left everyone speechless and exposed deep-rooted biases in the most unexpected ways. What followed was a lesson in resilience and a powerful testament to standing firm in the face of adversity. Stay with me, this is a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're reading from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and triumph. In the radiant glow of the coastal Malibu executive terminal, Sienna Carter, a trailblazing tech visionary, approached her jet. Her custom emerald green blazer and minimalist diamond earrings exuded quiet sophistication, masking the fierce determination that had carried her through years of adversity. The terminal itself was a haven for the elite, sleek leather furniture, the aroma of artisanal espresso, and walls of glass showcasing private jets on the tarmac. It was a sanctuary of wealth and exclusivity. Yet for Sienna, it had always felt like a battlefield where she had to prove, again and again, that she belonged. As she approached the desk with her flight details, a subtle tension filled the air. The attendant, a sharp-featured young man with a crisp uniform and a rehearsed politeness, barely glanced up from his computer as she arrived. His gaze lingered a second too long when he finally looked her over, his expression unreadable but laced with an unspoken question. "Good morning, ma'am. May I have your name and flight information?" he asked, his tone professionally detached. "Sienna Carter, private flight to Vancouver," she replied evenly, her voice calm but commanding. His fingers danced across the keyboard, pausing as a slight frown crossed his face. He glanced at her again, this time with barely concealed skepticism. "One moment, Ms. Carter," he said before disappearing into the back office. Sienna adjusted her diamond earrings, a reflex she'd developed over years of encounters like this. She had long since learned to maintain her composure in the face of doubt. Moments later, the attendant returned, followed by another figure, a man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a military posture. His captain's uniform bore the insignia of years of experience, but his expression was anything but welcoming. "Ms. Carter," the captain said, his tone clipped and formal. "I'm Captain Bryce Henderson. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private flight." "I'm aware," Sienna said, her voice steady. "It's my flight." Captain Henderson raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I see," he said slowly, his tone laced with condescension. "And do you have any proof of that, Ms. Carter?" Sienna held his gaze, refusing to be rattled. She pulled out her phone and tapped on the screen, pulling up the confirmation email that bore her name, the flight details, and the jet's registration. She handed it over without a word. The captain barely glanced at it before waving over a flight attendant. "Emily," he called, "can you verify this?" Emily, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard in hand, stepped forward. She took the phone and studied the email, her expression shifting as realization dawned. "It's all in order," she said, her voice almost a whisper as she handed the phone back. Henderson's smirk vanished, replaced by a tightly controlled expression. "Very well," he muttered, stepping aside. "Welcome aboard." But as Sienna ascended the steps to her jet, the real surprise awaited. Inside the cabin stood her assistant, Matteo, holding a folder. "We have a situation," he said quietly, his voice urgent. Sienna's eyes narrowed. "What kind of situation?" Matteo handed her the folder, and as she flipped through the pages, her jaw tightened. It wasn't just a matter of prejudice or doubt. There was something far more sinister at play, a scheme involving the captain, falsified documents, and a plot to reroute her jet for an unauthorized passenger. What happened next would not only expose the truth but shake the entire operation of the private terminal to its core. The crushing weight of being questioned in spaces she had every right to occupy lingered in her chest, a relentless fight for dignity in a world so eager to snatch it away. Inside the jet, Sienna Carter set her bag down and took a seat, her expression unreadable. She had won this round, but the game itself was far from over. The quiet luxury of the cabin surrounded her, with its cream-colored leather seats and polished teak accents, a reflection of Sienna's hard-earned success. Yet, even amidst this opulence, she couldn't shake the faint hum of unease, as if something darker lurked just beneath the surface. The tension from her earlier exchange with Captain Bryce Henderson clung to the air, a sharp reminder that no achievement could fully shield her from the unspoken hierarchies she navigated daily. A soft knock on the cabin door announced the return of the flight attendant, Emily, clipboard in hand and her steps hesitant. Her brittle smile, stretched thin across her face, did little to mask her unease. "Would you like a drink before takeoff, Ms. Carter?" Emily asked, her tone polite yet strained. "Water, please," Sienna replied, her voice calm but firm. Emily nodded and turned toward the small galley, but her steps faltered as Captain Henderson entered the cabin. His presence was a sharp intrusion, his eyes flickering briefly to Sienna before landing on Emily with a weight that made her pause. "Step outside with me for a moment," he said, his tone low but commanding. Emily glanced at Sienna, her uncertainty clear, before following Henderson out. The cabin door hissed softly as it sealed behind them, leaving Sienna alone with her thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, but her mind was restless. She had been in this position too many times before, the subject of whispered conferences, her legitimacy debated just out of earshot. It wasn't the overt insults or blatant hostility that wore her down. It was this, the constant questioning, the subtle erosion of dignity through 1,000 unspoken doubts. The minutes stretched, uncomfortable and long, before Emily returned. Her face was pale, her movements stiff as she placed a glass of water on the tray table with a faint clink. "Let me know if you need anything else," Emily murmured, her eyes avoiding Sienna's. Sienna studied her retreat, her expression calm but her mind racing. She didn't need to hear the hushed conversation to understand its essence. Henderson's attitude had been clear enough, and Emily's demeanor reflected the quiet calculations she had been forced to make, whether to align herself with authority or stand on principle. The engines hummed to life, and the jet began its taxi down the runway. Sienna closed her eyes briefly, focusing on her breath, on the steady rhythm that grounded her. This flight was more than a journey to Vancouver. It was another battle in an endless series of small, silent wars. As the plane lifted into the sky, Henderson emerged from the cockpit again, this time with a younger crew member in tow. The attendant, a nervous man named Lucas, carried a clipboard and a wary expression. "Ms. Carter," Henderson began, his words clipped and stiff. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding earlier. I want to assure you it won't happen again." Sienna raised an eyebrow, her silence compelling him to continue. "This flight is typically reserved for senior executives," he added, his tone teetering between condescension and defensiveness. "I am a senior executive," Sienna replied, her voice calm but laced with an edge. "Of course," Henderson said quickly, a faint flush rising to his cheeks. "But as you can imagine, we have protocols to maintain the integrity of our operations." Sienna tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And do these protocols include questioning the owner of the jet?" Lucas shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Henderson, who clenched his jaw. "There's no need to take this personally, Ms. Carter," Henderson said finally, the words forced and defensive. Sienna's faint smile didn't reach her eyes. "What you call protocol, Captain, I call assumptions. And assumptions are always personal, especially when they seem to follow certain patterns." Henderson opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. With a curt nod, he retreated toward the cockpit, his authority diminished but not entirely undone. Henderson opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. With a curt nod, he retreated toward the cockpit, his authority diminished but not entirely undone. Lucas hesitated for a moment, as though he wanted to speak, but he too retreated. Sienna sat back, her expression serene but her mind sharp. This was the second challenge of the day, and the plane had barely left the ground. The tension in the cabin was subtle but pervasive, a quiet reminder that the fight for dignity was never truly over, it had only shifted arenas. As the jet leveled out at cruising altitude, Sienna turned her gaze to the window, watching the clouds roll past. For every moment of defiance, there would be another test, another subtle maneuver to undermine her presence. She had learned to meet these challenges with grace, but she was tired. Tired of the smallness of minds, tired of the endless weight of assumptions she had never invited. And yet, Sienna resolved, she would not be the one to falter. Not today. The quiet hum of the jet engines filled the cabin, a sound designed to soothe and insulate its occupants from the chaos of the outside world. But for Sienna Carter, the noise only heightened her awareness of the unspoken tensions within these luxurious walls. Sienna Carter was no stranger to the unmarked boundaries that people silently imposed, boundaries that quietly declared who was truly welcome and who was merely tolerated. Today was proving no different. Not long after the jet leveled out, the younger flight attendant, Lucas, reappeared with a meal tray. His hands trembled slightly as he set it down on the table in front of Sienna. The tray was elegant, adorned with fine china and a meticulously arranged salad, but Sienna noticed something missing. "Excuse me," Sienna said, her tone even but firm. "Could I have the dressing for this?" Lucas hesitated, his eyes darting toward the back of the cabin. "I'll check, ma'am," he murmured before scurrying off. Minutes passed, long enough for Sienna to recognize the familiar rhythm of avoidance. She took a sip of water, waiting. When Lucas returned, he was empty-handed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he stammered. "It seems we've run out." Sienna raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. She had been on enough flights, owned enough jets, to know that running out of something as basic as salad dressing was highly unlikely. But it wasn't the dressing that mattered. It was the lie, the quiet dismissal disguised as a logistical issue, a message louder than any confrontation. "That's unfortunate," Sienna replied, her voice calm but laced with meaning. "Perhaps next time the flight manifest can ensure the jet's owner is adequately accommodated." Lucas flushed deeply, mumbling an apology before retreating. Sienna let the matter drop, pressing further would be pointless. The dressing wasn't the point, it was never the point. Halfway through the flight, Captain Bryce Henderson made another appearance. His tall frame filled the cabin doorway, and his forced smile barely masked the tension etched into his features. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice a touch too polite. "I wanted to personally apologize for the earlier misunderstanding." Sienna folded her hands in her lap, her calm scrutiny a silent invitation for him to continue. "I assure you," Henderson said, his words rehearsed, "we pride ourselves on providing a seamless experience for all our passengers. If there's anything we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable, please let me know." It was a masterclass in surface-level contrition, designed to soothe without addressing the deeper insult. Sienna's faint smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Captain Henderson," she replied. "But what I require isn't comfort, it's respect. And that, I believe, is beyond your current protocols." His smile faltered for the briefest moment, the mask slipping just enough to reveal his discomfort. With a stiff nod, he excused himself, retreating to the cockpit. As the flight neared its destination, the jet encountered turbulence, a sudden, sharp reminder of the uncontrollable forces at play. The passengers, few as they were, clutched their armrests as the plane jolted. Sienna, however, remained calm, her eyes fixed on the clouds outside the window. She had weathered worse storms than this. When the turbulence subsided, Emily reappeared, her face pale. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice quieter than before, "The captain wanted me to inform you that we may experience delays upon landing due to expected weather." Sienna nodded but said nothing. She could sense there was more behind Emily's nervous demeanor than mere weather delays. These moments of friction, minor, almost invisible to the untrained eye, accumulated like drops of water eroding stone. They were designed to test her resolve, to see if she would bend or break under the weight of 1,000 small slights. But she would not. As the plane began its descent, Sienna leaned back in her seat, her mind replaying the day's events. Each moment, a missing salad dressing, a half-hearted apology, a strained explanation, was part of a larger mosaic, painting a vivid picture of a society still struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. The lines dividing who was seen and who was invisible, who was respected and who was merely tolerated, were as clear to her now as they had been all her life. She knew the journey wouldn't end when the wheels touched down. The real turbulence wasn't in the sky, it was in the spaces where people refused to confront their own assumptions. And Sienna Carter would continue to push against those invisible lines, not for the sake of defiance, but for the dignity she knew was her right. The descent into Vancouver was smooth, the skyline coming into view as the jet broke through the clouds. Towering buildings reflected the sunlight, a city bustling with ambition and life. But inside Sienna Carter's private jet, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Beneath the surface of polished professionalism and subdued luxury, tension rippled like an undercurrent, quiet but unmistakable. As the wheels touched down, Lucas appeared once again, his demeanor more formal than it had been earlier. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice measured, "we've arrived. We'll be taxiing to the private hangar shortly." Sienna nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said simply, though the faintest edge in her voice hinted at her exhaustion, not from the journey, but from the quiet battles fought along the way. The jet slowed to a stop, the cabin doors opening to the crisp air of Vancouver. Below, the ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, their tasks executed with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Inside, Captain Bryce Henderson made his final appearance, lingering at the cabin doorway. His posture was tense, as though bracing himself for another confrontation. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "I hope your flight was satisfactory." Sienna met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unnerve him. "It was adequate," she said finally, her words laced with an unspoken message. Adequate was far beneath what she deserved. Descending the steps of the jet, Sienna was greeted by a sleek black sedan waiting for her on the tarmac. The driver, a young man named Alex, stepped out with a warm smile. His demeanor was a stark contrast to the cold professionalism she had endured earlier. "Welcome to Vancouver, Ms. Carter," he said, opening the door for her. "Thank you, Alex," Sienna replied, her voice softening for the first time that day. She slipped into the back seat, the familiar comfort of the car offering a brief respite from the subtle hostilities that had defined her journey. The drive to the Carter Dynamics headquarters was uneventful, the city's rhythm unfolding outside the car window. When they arrived, the building, a sleek, modern structure of glass and steel, stood tall against the backdrop of Vancouver's bustling streets. It was a testament to Sienna's forward-thinking vision and relentless drive. As she stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking against the polished floors, the receptionist, a young woman named Claire, greeted her with the same practiced politeness Sienna had encountered countless times before. But there was a flicker of hesitation in Claire's expression as her eyes darted between Sienna and the screen in front of her. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," Claire said, her tone tinged with uncertainty. "I wasn't aware you'd be visiting today." "I prefer to keep my arrivals unannounced," Sienna replied, her faint smile pointed. "It keeps everyone on their toes." Claire nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Of course. I'll notify Mr. Thompson that you're here." Sienna made her way to the top floor, where the executive offices were housed. As she entered the boardroom, the low hum of conversation ceased abruptly. The room was filled with Carter Dynamics executives, most of them older, most of them white. Their surprise at seeing her was palpable, though no one dared to voice it. She took her seat at the head of the table, her presence a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. The meeting began, and as the agenda unfolded, Sienna noticed the subtle ways her authority was questioned, a pointed remark about legacy leadership, a dismissive tone when discussing her strategic initiatives, a sideways glance that lingered a beat too long. It wasn't until Robert, one of the senior executives, directly challenged her decision on an upcoming project that the undercurrent of doubt fully surfaced. "With all due respect, Ms. Carter," he began, his tone measured but condescending, "this initiative feels overly ambitious. Perhaps we should reconsider the timing." Sienna tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "Overly ambitious or absolutely necessary?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with authority. "Perhaps you'd like to clarify, Robert." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence faltering under her scrutiny. "I simply mean we should proceed cautiously," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "Caution is important," Sienna replied, her tone unyielding. "But stagnation is not an option. This initiative is not just ambitious, it's critical. And it will proceed as planned." Her words landed heavily in the room, like a stone dropped into still water. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken tension. Sienna could see it in their faces, the discomfort, the unspoken resistance. But she also knew that disruption was necessary. Change was never comfortable. As the meeting concluded, Sienna lingered in the boardroom, watching as the others filed out. She stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The day had been filled with challenges, each one a stark reminder of the barriers that persisted even at the highest levels of power. But Sienna Carter had not built her empire by yielding to those barriers. She had built it by breaking them, one by one, with grace and determination. And she would continue to do so, not just for herself, but for the countless others who faced the same quiet, insidious challenges every day. And fears older than the city itself, she resolved to keep fighting. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, in words or in silence, that they did not belong. Night had fallen over Vancouver, but the lights of Carter Dynamics offices burned brightly, a beacon of unyielding ambition. Sienna Carter remained in her office, the hum of her computer the only sound breaking the stillness. The day's challenges lingered in her mind like storm clouds refusing to dissipate. Her desk phone buzzed. It was Mara. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice subdued. "The security team would like to brief you on the situation outside. They're concerned it could escalate." Sienna straightened her blazer, her expression calm but resolute. "Tell them I'll meet them in 5 minutes." She turned back to the window, her reflection meeting her gaze. Outside, the protesters' chants rose faintly through the glass, a chorus of discontent. Sienna knew this was not the end, only another chapter in a story that was far from finished. Yet, she resolved, she would meet it head-on. She always did. Sienna Carter paused for a moment before replying, "Send them in." Moments later, 2 security officers entered, their expressions tense. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man named Davis, spoke first. "Ms. Carter, we've been monitoring the crowd. So far, it's peaceful, but we've noticed a few individuals who seem agitated. It might be wise to leave through the back entrance tonight." Sienna regarded him calmly, her voice measured. "And what message does that send?" she asked. "That I'm afraid. That I can be intimidated." Davis hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. "It's about safety, ma'am," he said finally. "We don't want to take any chances." "I appreciate your concern," Sienna replied, her tone firm. "But I won't be sneaking out of my own building like a thief in the night. I'll leave as I always do, through the front." The officers exchanged glances, their reluctance evident, but they nodded and left. Sienna turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps, but in a world constantly trying to undermine her, even the small acts mattered. The next morning brought a new challenge, one as insidious as it was predictable. An email from Robert, marked urgent, landed in her inbox. The subject line read, "Revisiting the initiative." Sienna opened it, her lips pressing into a thin line as she read the carefully veiled language. The intent was clear, another attempt to stall her progress, wrapped in the guise of prudence. She forwarded the email to Mara with a simple instruction: schedule it for noon. No delays. By noon, the boardroom was filled again. Robert sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a few allies whose body language made their alignment clear. Sienna entered and took her seat at the head, her posture unyielding. Robert began with a preamble, couching his objections in the language of fiscal responsibility and shareholder trust. He gestured to a series of charts projected on the screen, rehashing risks that had already been addressed in previous meetings. "This isn't about questioning your leadership, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone patronizing. "It's about ensuring that we move forward in a way that protects the company's legacy." Sienna let him speak, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Legacy," she repeated, her tone deliberate. "That's an interesting choice of words, Robert. Because if this company's legacy is one of fear and hesitation, then I suppose you're right, we should reconsider. But that's not the legacy I've built." She let her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Carter Dynamics didn't rise to where it is by waiting for the world to make us comfortable. We got here by seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing heavily on everyone present. "Now," Sienna said, her voice firm, "if there are valid concerns about this initiative, new concerns, ones that haven't already been addressed, I'm willing to hear them. But if this is just another attempt to stall progress, let me assure you it will not succeed." Robert shifted in his seat, visibly shaken. The other executives exchanged uneasy glances, their hesitation speaking louder than words. "Very well," he said finally, his tone subdued. "Let's proceed as planned." Sienna gave a slight nod. It was a small victory, but she knew the war was far from over. That evening, as Sienna prepared to leave the office, the protesters were still there. From her vantage point, she could now see their signs clearly. Some bore messages of genuine concern about corporate accountability and equity, but others were far more pointed. One sign read, "Who's really in charge here?" The implication was unmistakable. Sienna paused at the building's entrance, her driver Alex waiting nearby. The moment she appeared, the crowd fell momentarily silent, their chants giving way to murmurs. For a brief second, she considered addressing them directly, explaining her vision, her decisions. But she knew this wasn't the time. Instead, she stepped into the car, her resolve as firm as ever. As the car pulled away, Sienna stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. The day had been long, the challenges relentless, but she felt no despair. If anything, the resistance only strengthened her resolve. For every barrier she faced, she knew there were others watching, people who drew strength from her defiance, who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. Her journey was far from over, but Sienna knew she would continue. Each step forward was a victory, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in a world where dignity and justice were not privileges, but rights. The next morning, Sienna Carter arrived at Carter Dynamics earlier than usual. The city was still waking, its streets bathed in the pale blue light of dawn. But even in the quiet hours, the weight of the day ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. The tension from the protests lingered in her mind, and the internal resistance within her company was as persistent as ever. As she stepped into the lobby, she noticed Claire, the receptionist, shifting uncomfortably behind the desk. When Claire glanced up and saw Sienna, she hesitated before offering a tight smile. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," Claire said. "Good morning, Claire," Sienna replied, her tone neutral but observant. Everything all right? Claire hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her clipboard. There's something you should see. It's been circulating online. Sienna frowned, watching as Claire turned her monitor to face her. On the screen was a shaky video, but the setting was unmistakable. The Carter Dynamics building loomed in the background. A man stood before a small crowd of protesters, speaking into a microphone. His words were measured but pointed. "We're here because corporations like Carter Dynamics claim to be progressive," he said, his voice amplified by a portable speaker. "They claim to champion diversity. But look closely. Look at who's making the decisions. Look at who's truly benefiting." He paused, scanning the crowd before delivering his final line with precision. "We're here to ask, who does Sienna Carter really represent?" The crowd murmured in agreement as the man continued, his accusations growing sharper. Though he didn't say it outright, the insinuation was clear: Sienna's leadership, her very presence, was being reframed as a symbol of exclusion rather than progress. Sienna's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the screen. This wasn't the first time her integrity had been questioned, but the familiarity of the attack didn't dull its sting. "Thank you, Claire," she said, her tone calm. "I'll handle it. Underscore 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 underscore. Sienna spent the morning addressing the ripple effects of the video. Her public relations team was already drafting statements, carefully crafted to deflect criticism without fueling the flames. But as she reviewed their work, Sienna felt a growing frustration. The words felt hollow, disconnected from the truth of what she faced every day. By midday, the tension boiled over during a meeting with the executive team. Robert, emboldened by the external criticism, seized the opportunity to voice his concerns again. "With all due respect, Ms. Carter," he began, his tone overly formal, "perhaps we need to consider the optics here. The protests aren't just about the initiative, they're about perception. Maybe we should pause and reassess." Sienna's gaze locked onto him, her patience wearing thin. "Pause and reassess," she repeated, her voice low but cutting. "And what exactly do you think that will accomplish, Robert? Appeasing people who've already decided to misrepresent what we stand for?" Robert shifted uncomfortably, but he pressed on. "It's not just about them, Ms. Carter. It's about stakeholders. About public trust. If we're seen as out of touch." Sienna interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Do you think I don't understand what's at stake? Do you think I haven't spent my entire career navigating these waters, balancing perception and reality?" The room fell silent, her words heavy with emotion. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about perception. This is about who we are and what we stand for. I will not allow fear, whether it comes from outside this building or within it, to dictate our decisions. We move forward. Period. Underscore 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 underscore. As the day wore on, Sienna found herself reflecting on the deeper roots of the resistance she faced. It wasn't just about the initiative or the protests, it was about the quiet storm of prejudice that had shadowed her every step. People didn't question her authority openly. Instead, they cloaked their doubts in polite suggestions and subtle critiques. It was the same storm she had weathered as a young woman navigating boardrooms where she was the only one who looked like her. It was the storm that whispered, "You don't belong here," even as she built an empire. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Sienna stopped by the window of her office. The protesters were still there, their numbers smaller now but no less vocal. She watched them for a moment, her reflection merging with the city lights beyond. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "You can't control the storm, but you can decide how you walk through it." Sienna straightened her shoulders and turned away from the window. She wasn't just walking through the storm, she was reshaping it, one step at a time. The boardroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm but doesn't promise calm. Sienna Carter sat at the head of the long table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Around her, the executives shuffled papers, their movements betraying unease. It was an unscheduled meeting, called by Sienna herself, and the urgency was palpable. For weeks, the protests outside Carter Dynamics had grown louder. Their message, muddled by misinformation but undeniably potent, was making waves. Inside the company, dissent simmered beneath the surface. The intersection of public outcry and internal resistance had created a perfect storm, one that Sienna could no longer ignore. She took a deep breath and began. "Let's talk about the truth," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Not the sanitized truth that fits neatly into a press release, but the real truth about what's happening here." The room stiffened. Sienna let her words settle before continuing. "The protests outside our building aren't just about a single initiative. They're about something much deeper, something this company, and everyone in this room, needs to confront. They're about who we are and who we claim to be." Predictably, Robert was the first to speak. "With all due respect, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone tinged with condescension, "we've already addressed these issues. The public doesn't understand the nuances of corporate decision-making. This is a PR problem, not a leadership one." Sienna turned to Robert, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "No, Robert," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just a PR problem. It's a leadership problem, because we've allowed it to become one. And let me be clear, the public understands far more than you give them credit for. They see the cracks we've ignored for too long." She stood, commanding the room with her presence. "We talk about diversity. We talk about inclusion. But too often, those words are just decorations on a mission statement. The reality is that people like me, people who don't fit the mold of what leadership is supposed to look like, are still fighting to prove we belong, even when we've earned our place 100 times over." Her words cut through the tension like a blade, exposing the unspoken truths that had lingered in the room for years. As the meeting continued, Sienna outlined a bold plan, not just to move the initiative forward but to confront the deeper issues underlying the resistance. She proposed new systems of accountability, mandatory bias training, and greater transparency in decision-making processes. The plan was ambitious, even radical, but it was also necessary. "This isn't just about protecting our brand," she said, her voice resolute. "It's about living up to the principles we claim to stand for. If we're not willing to do that, then what's the point?" By the time the meeting adjourned, the room buzzed with a mix of resistance and reluctant agreement. Sienna knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the only way. As the executives filed out, Sienna remained behind, standing by the large windows overlooking the city. The protesters were still gathered below, their signs illuminated by the glow of streetlights. But tonight, something felt different. The noise wasn't just a reminder of the challenges she faced, it was a testament to the power of voices refusing to be silenced. Later that evening, Sienna joined Alex in the waiting car. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the city fading into the background as she reflected on the day. At a red light, she glanced out the window and noticed a young woman holding a sign that read, "We deserve better." The words struck a chord. They weren't just about the company or the protests, they were about everything Sienna had fought for and everything she continued to fight for. The right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. When she arrived home, the night was still. Sienna stepped into her living room, where a photograph of her parents sat on the mantel. Their faces reflected the strength and resilience they had passed on to her. They had taught her that the fight for justice was never over but always worth it. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the day pressing on her. But she felt no despair. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. The challenges she faced were daunting, but they were not insurmountable. As long as she had the strength to stand, she would continue to push forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her.